It's Mrs. Horseman, and today we're going to be talking about ecosystems and biological communities. Just a reminder, we go over our objectives. So this unit, we are going to be explaining biotic and abiotic factors that constitute an ecosystem. We are also going to look at food webs and how that demonstrates all the levels of organization within an ecosystem. So we're looking at all of the different types of interactions within that ecosystem. And then we're going to analyze the energy transfer in an energy pyramid and determine the total amount of energy that consumers at the top of the pyramid might be consuming. So that's a lot to do today. We also are going to be looking at a lot of vocabulary. Okay, there's a ton of vocabulary with this unit. So highly suggest that you use something to help you practice that vocabulary on a daily basis. So you could do flashcards, you could do websites such as Quizlet.com, whatever helps you review that vocabulary, but you need to understand all these words. It's very important. So with that being said, let's talk about ecosystems. So how do populations interact with living and non-living parts of their environment? Scientists study this form of science called ecology, which is the study of interactions of living organisms with one another and with their physical environment. So when we're talking about physical environment, we're talking about the soil, the climate, the rocks, the weather, the water, all of that different kind of stuff, okay? When we talk about a habitat, we're talking about the place where a particular population of a species lives, okay? So we're talking about that one area that they populate. So how is the world organized? Really quickly, I just want to talk about a few key factors. We're looking at the biosphere, which is the very largest part of our world. Okay, so that is the Earth. The Earth is our biosphere. Then that is broken down into ecosystems. So an ecosystem is one given area within that biosphere. A community is even smaller. A community is looking at all of the living organisms that live within and interact within that ecosystem. And then smaller than that is a population. So it's looking at, and in this case, just the fish that live within that ecosystem. Or we could be looking at that specific species of rabbit that lives in that ecosystem. And then we're looking at a species. And a species is just that one little type of organism, okay? So, another vocabulary word. We've kind of talked about this a little bit when we talked about evolution, but just a reminder, a population is talking about all of the individuals of that same species. So for example, we're talking about all of the bass within this given area, okay? Or we could be talking about all of the water weeds or all of the bacteria that live in the water, anything like that. That is a population. A community is talking about all of the different species in that area. So we're talking about the bass and the grass and the dragonflies and the bacteria and the algae, whatever else happens to be alive in that area. But then when we talk about an ecosystem, we're talking about all of the living organisms in that area. So all of the community, plus we're talking about physical factors. So we're talking about the bass and the grass and the dragonflies and the temperature, and the soil content, and the rainfall, and any other factors that play within that area. Okay, that is the ecosystem. All right, so now that we know what ecosystems and communities and populations are, let's talk about the living and the non-living elements. Remember from the very beginning of the school year, we said that bio meant living. Okay, so biotic factors are the living elements in the ecosystem. So we're looking at the plants and the animals and the bacteria, all that live within that given area, okay? What happens when you put the prefix a in front of a word? Do you remember? It means not. So abiotic factors are the non-living elements in that ecosystem. So that's looking at the soil and the temperature and the water, the noise. Anything that is not considered living that has an impact on that environment is an abiotic factor, non-living factor. Okay, so then when we're talking about biodiversity, biodiversity is measurement of kind of how healthy the environment is, but we're specifically looking at the measurement of the number of species within an ecosystem. Some ecosystems are definitely more diverse than others. If you look at the Antarctic, there's not many living species that live there. We're talking about a handful of different kinds of fish, some penguins, not a lot else. Maybe some small plants that live in the area, but we're not looking at a lot. On the other hand, rainforests are incredibly biodiverse. They're actually so biodiverse that scientists think we haven't even scratched the surface of determining all of the living organisms that live in that area. So that's what we're talking about when we say biodiversity. We're just looking at the number of living organisms that live in that area. And like I said, some are much more diverse than others. So just look at this graphic for a second. We are talking about, here's our ecosystem, and we're looking at the environment right here. Okay, so here's our environment, all of the things that create that ecosystem. And we're going to divide that into biotic and abiotic factors. So if you look over here, we're just looking at the living things. We've got the crows and the different kinds of trees that are in the background, some shrubs, some grasses, some water weeds. We've got lily pads. We have our fish. We have our water bird. Okay, and then up here is a frog, but you just don't see it. If you are looking at this one, we've got a frog, maybe some algae going on. Okay, now, if you take out all of the living factors, what you're going to see are the abiotic factors. So here we have the water, which you notice on the other side of the picture was actually missing. We have the rocks and the soil, and we've got the dirt over here, which is where the trees would be if there are actually trees in the picture. We've got our rain clouds that are raining in the background. So those are all of the non-living factors of that environment. In an ecosystem, we know that there's a flow of energy. Okay, so we're talking about what eats what. Where does the original source of energy come from, and where does that energy go to? Okay, to answer this, we need to know that there are trophic levels in an ecosystem. And when I'm talking about trophic levels, I'm talking about the organisms that are assigned a specific level based on their source of energy. So based on what they are eating or where they are getting their energy from. Trophic levels can be shown in a food chain, okay? So all energy originally comes from the sun. Do we agree with that? When we talked about photosynthesis, we said that all energy originates from sunlight, right? Okay, so then we have our plants that convert that light energy into a chemical energy. And then we have organisms that eat those plants, so they're gaining that chemical energy, and then it goes on through the food chain, okay? So if you look here, the first thing that we talk about are primary producers, or we can just call them producers. Those are the organisms that use the energy of the sun in order to create our chemical energy through the process of photosynthesis. And we're looking at plants and algae specifically when we talk about producers, okay? Then we have the organisms that eat the producers. We call those primary consumers. Another word for a primary consumer might be, or is, an herbivore. And herbivores are animals that eat those plants or other primary producers as their primary source of energy. Okay, so an example that you might be familiar with, cows, horses, grasshoppers, rabbits, antelope, all of the things that eat plants in order to survive. Then we have our secondary consumers. So those are the next level, and secondary consumers are the things that eat the organisms that eat the plants. Okay, so here we're talking about carnivores. So these are animals that eat other animals for their primary food source. You also might be talking about omnivores. So omnivores are organisms that eat both carnivores, or that are both carnivores and herbivores. So they eat both meat and veggies. Okay, we are omnivores for the most part. So they get their energy from both animals and plant organisms. And then there's also detrivores, are considered secondary consumers. And detrivores are organisms that gain energy from waste and from consuming dead bodies or decomposing bodies. So an example of that might be bacteria or fungus. Fungus is a mushroom. Mushrooms are not considered a plant, remember, because they don't have chloroplast. They get their energy from other sources. So those would be detrivores. Then you have your tertiary consumers, and tertiary consumers are carnivores that eat other carnivores. So an example of that might be like a hawk that eats a rabbit. Actually, rabbits aren't carnivores, so that won't work. Maybe a hawk that eats a snake, and the snake eats a mouse, which is a herbivore, okay, and on and on. So those are tertiary consumers, carnivores that eat other carnivores. So if you're looking at this food chain, what you see here is the sun, our primary source of energy, and that sun is giving energy to the plants, and they're converting that light energy into chemical energy through the process of photosynthesis, okay? Then we have our grasshopper who eats the grass. Then we have the frog that eats the grasshopper. Then we have the snake that eats the frog, and then we have the hawk that eats the snake. If you notice, the arrows here are pointing to where the energy is going, okay? So the thing that's eating the other thing, or the thing that's giving the energy to the other organism, is where the arrow points, okay? So if we're gonna label real fast, so we know the sun is the original source of energy, here is our producer, or we could say a primary producer. This is eating the grass, so the grasshopper would be our primary consumer, or our herbivore. The frog is eating the grasshopper, so he would be our secondary consumer, or our carnivore. Here we have our tertiary consumer. This is the carnivore that's eating another carnivore, okay? And then this one is actually showing a quaternary consumer, which the hawk is eating a carnivore who eats the carnivore, okay? Most food chains do not go above a tertiary or quaternary consumer. Okay, once you get up to that rate, up to that level, you're not getting a lot of energy out of the things that you're eating. So those those tertiary and quaternary consumers are going to have to start eating a lot of food to get the energy that they need to make sure that they're maintaining their energy in their bodies. Okay. When you put a bunch of food chains together, you're actually going to see something called a food web. And a food web is just interconnected food chains, because most organisms don't just eat one thing, okay? So within that community, a lot of organisms have lots of different relationships with the other organisms that are also within that community or within that ecosystem. Oops. So here we have our grass, and you can actually see there's lots of things that are eating that grass. We have our long-eared rabbits. We have little grass mice, we have a sparrow, a grasshopper. Those are all eating the grass. And then you have here, we've got a lizard that's eating the grasshoppers. We have the bird is also eating the grasshoppers. We have a snake that's eating the mice. And then we also have the snake that's eating the rabbit, and the snake that's eating the bird, and the snake that's eating the lizard. And then we have a very large bird, like a hawk or something like that, which is going to be eating the snake and the mouse and the rabbit. And then over here in the corner we have our mushrooms, our fungus, and those are going to be our detrivores. So they kind of gain energy from everything. So anything that passes food through its system by pooping, or they die and the leftovers of that organism get kind of buried underground, and the fungus is actually going to take that and deteriorate it, and it's actually going to return some of those nutrients back to the soil. So those are really important organisms that live in our community. Sounds kind of gross, but they are super important. All right, so using the food web that I just showed you, I want you to pause, you can go back, and I want you to list these following things. I want you to list a producer, at least 2 herbivores. I want you to list a carnivore, an omnivore, and a detrivore, and then the tertiary and quaternary consumers, because there actually is a quaternary consumer on that food web. So go ahead and pause and do that, and we will make sure that we talk about it in class. I also want to remind you that there are so many vocabulary words. You have to make sure you understand them. If you don't understand, make sure you come to class with questions, and make sure you're reviewing that vocabulary. All right? See you soon.